So the webinar is just to explain a little bit about the grant, the criteria for applying, and then some basic information about the, we'll say, projects, typical kinds of projects that have been awarded in the past. One of the things we'd like to do as well is to give you some tips for assembling a strong proposal. So as you're thinking about your project or your research or your educational program, feel free to reach out, but also look at the details. You'll see that it's actually quite broad in terms of the opportunity and in terms of the kinds of projects that are eligible for this grant program. So here we have a QR code that you can use to access the program and look at the information on the website. The purpose is very straightforward. It's really to foster development of peace psychology worldwide. And it's also to promote research, education, and application of peace psychology. This doesn't mean that your project has to encompass all of these things. Your project has to fit within one of these goals, or as it happens, more than one of these goals. Many projects fit within more than one of these. So if you're able to explain how you're fostering the development of peace psychology worldwide and or promoting research, promoting education, or promoting the application of peace psychology, your project is eligible to, receive funds. As I mentioned, there are three main types that we typically get, and these are just the things that we have envisioned in the past, and sort of three buckets into which we sort of categorize projects. But in reality, we've received a really nice array of very creative, different types of projects that may not, on the face of them, look like a typical education project or a typical research project. And as you can imagine, community projects can be really diverse, different from one another, and different based on the location or the goal to which they're aimed. So how much money can you ask for? We're very excited that this year, the amount of money that's been given by the division for this grant has increased, and it has actually increased over the last 3 years successively. So not only is the whole grant fund increased, but also the amount that an individual can request has been increased. So you can request anything between $300 and $5,000. As long as you're able to develop and propose a budget that explains how you would spend that funding that the committee can look at and adjudicate, you can ask for any amount in between $300 and $5,000. As you'll see on the website, there are some limitations or restrictions around what you can spend the funds on. The first one is that you cannot spend it on conference travel or convention travel. And the reason behind that is that traveling to a convention or traveling to a conference can be quite expensive, and it's not actually necessarily directly furthering the cause of peace psychology or developing research or applications of peace. What we would hope is that you would partner with an organization who can support you in conference travel. We would really like to support the activity of peace education or peace psychology education. Another thing we cannot have applicants spend the money on is on institutional administration charges or stipends to a principal investigator or a project director. That's mainly for tax purposes. It ends up being a different type of expenditure under tax purposes if it's a stipend to an investigator or a stipend to a project director. Assistance, however, can be allowed. So graduate assistants, teaching assistants can be a component of it. The other area that it cannot be used to pay for are living expenses. And again, that's very similar to the first limitation. Living expenses for the individual are a secondary support as opposed to a direct support for the project itself. And we know that that can sometimes limit whether or not you can engage in the project. And that's why we would really encourage you to seek funding that can help you in those areas as well. So who is eligible? Division 48 members are eligible. All Division 48 members are eligible. And it's important for you to know that you can be a member of Division 48 without being a member of the American Psychological Association in general. And that makes a big difference financially to a lot of folks. The cost of joining Division 48 is significantly lower than the cost of joining or being a member of the American Psychological Association. What's important also in terms of being awarded is that you are a member. Really, we would prefer if you're a member during the application phase. So prior to submitting your application, we really would prefer if you're a member. If there are any financial issues around that, please let us know, and we will make sure to try and help you in any way we can. There are members of Division 48 who are interested in sponsoring folks who are unable to join for financial reasons. Another group that may or may not be eligible for a grant are those who have previously received a grant. So for example, if you received a grant, this grant within the past 3 years, you're not yet eligible to reapply. So you can only apply, if you're an awardee, you can only apply once every 3 years. And we think that's important to provide greater access to a broader number of people. It's important for you to note as well that we give at least 50% of the grant awards to individuals who are either graduate students or early career professionals. Here we say it's within 5 years of beginning the career, but really it can be whatever you consider early career, and you would give us some examples or evidence of that. And the reason we make that a little bit more flexible is because there are different definitions of what an early career professional is, and we really don't want to be very rigid about that. It can be very easy for a person to explain why and how they're in the early stages of their careers. So I would encourage you not to let that piece discourage you from applying. The other thing that's really important for you to know is that anyone from anywhere in the world can apply. And we're really excited that over the last 4 years, people have applied from all over the world, and we have awarded the funds to people in various different countries. And so we really hope that you'll consider your project to be suitable and within the goals of the grant. If you're not yet a member, you can see this great QR code here on the side. Thank you, Stephanie. You can follow that QR code and figure out how to join. So down to practicalities, what's the timeline? The grant proposals are due by June 1st. And the application form is a Google form, and there's a link there to the Google form where you submit everything, all of your information, including your attachments. You can find that form also on the Peace Psychology website, and there's a link to that there above the May 2022 date. It's very important that you prepare and submit all parts of the application. It's a very straightforward application. It's not very long. Your documents also don't need to be very long, but it's important that you answer all the questions and enter all of that information and documents that's required. The committee will get together just before the grant proposal deadline, and then we will immediately begin our work of reviewing the grants right after the submission deadline of June 1st. We start right away so that we are able to then announce the winners or the awardees by July 15th. And we're pretty excited about that. We have a very efficient committee process. Many of our committee members are actually previous awardees. And so it's just wonderful to be able to include them in the process and to be able to, continue the work and build this community. In terms of how long you get to spend the grant funding, you actually get 18 months to complete your project or implement your project. We really are grateful to Josh for helping us promote the great successes, the great news and updates, and really the outcomes of all of our different projects. Josh presents or prepares this material and these updates for the peace psychologist, and so really shares that information broadly and is able to help you make the best presentation or the best news update so that more people can understand what you've been doing, what you're hoping to do, what your goals are, and how your project is coming along. It really brings the projects to life. So down to the nuts and bolts of what the application looks like. As I said, it's pretty straightforward. You need to write a letter that summarizes what your project is and your application. You need to include your CV or resume and those of any other members who are leading the project. You don't have to include the CV of every single person who's involved, but the drivers, the leaders, the directors of the project need to be included, and their resumes should be uploaded to the application process. The proposal questions are about a description, a short description of your project, what you're expecting this project is going to do in terms of benefits, what the overall goal and purpose of it is, and what the outcomes are that you're hoping for. How your project will contribute to the field of peace psychology, what your timeline is. It'll be important to be practical about that. And this is all in a descriptive proposal. This is in a document. How you're going to evaluate whether or not your project has achieved the proposed outcomes. Your budget should be as detailed as you can make it. Obviously, it's a proposed budget, but more detail is better than less. It helps the committee really be able to look and see whether or not this is a viable plan. And then the qualifications of the applicants to complete this project. It's important to be able to show the committee that this is a realistic project. It can be implemented based on the expertise, access, knowledge, and network of the applicant. And so if you have any questions about that, or you've got something that's in process, feel free to reach out if you've got questions. So as I said earlier, the grants, the website has a link and has more information, really detailed information about the grants program. And there's a QR code and a link there for it. The application form itself, there's a QR code for it and a link. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Then when we get to that committee work, as I mentioned, it's really about those practicalities, whether it's a feasible project, whether it will fulfill its purpose. So it can't be just a lofty goal that doesn't have specific details, whether it's relevant to the field of peace psychology and has real potential for, on the ground, advancing the field. And then your ability to be able to complete the project within 18 months. We are aware of the difficulties that the pandemic has caused and the interruptions and the obstacles it has put in, in the way of lots of different projects. Don't let that restrict you. Be optimistic about what you think you would like to do. Many awardees have actually been able to work around pandemic restrictions, and at times they have had to change certain elements of the project. What you would do there is you would communicate with me what your proposal is and what your request is to maybe adjust things slightly because of a new pandemic restriction or whatever obstacle comes in your way. But that's after the fact, after you're awarded. So, put in there what your vision is, what your dream is for what you can do, who will be involved, and how you're really going to make this a feasible project. And again, we're aware of how difficult it is when you're a student or when you're an early career professional and you're really trying to make your mark and do some of these early projects. It can be difficult for you and not as easy as it is for, we'll say, for a seasoned career person who already has lots of networks, lots of opportunities. So don't be shy about saying what you really would like to happen. So what does it take to actually win the award or awards for the grant? Focusing on impact, the impact of your project, the group that it's targeted towards, how it will impact them and how you know it will impact them, like how you're going to evaluate that. In your application and in your proposal, tell the story, bring us into the persuasive idea and vision that you have. And then be specific. When and how are you going to do it? It doesn't have to be a literature review. It needs to be short and detailed, but it does have to have references to, if it's, for example, research, it does have to have references to the field because it's related to the field of peace psychology and needs to be grounded in the state of the field and the definitions of the field. So I'm going to hand you over to Josh to share a little bit about our past projects, past awardees.
All right. Thank you, Brida. So I'm Josh, and my work over the past couple of years has been to feature a lot of the past awardees of the small grants from Division 48. And it's really been a privilege to speak to all the different awardees coming from different backgrounds, working on different projects. And I thought this part of the webinar could be a fruitful space to kind of share what kinds of projects have been awarded in the past. I think Brida did a really great job just now to highlight how the diversity of the research and diversity of context that's supported by these grants are one of the big emphases of the small grants. And I think if you look at the past projects, you'll really see solid evidence that just all these different ways of supporting peace, of promoting peace psychology have really been brought to life because of these grants. So some features of the projects that we've shared details about in the Peace Psychologist in the past are creativity and passion for peace. So, for example, you might have this maybe abstract or rigid idea about what peace psychology should mean, or what you think the world would care about, or what you think, I don't know, some academics might care about. But I think one of the most interesting things that's come out of the past few years of small grant awardees is that often it takes like an original view that comes really from your personal history, from your personal interests and personal beliefs about what can be done in the world to promote peace psychology, to really come up with a project that that has meaning and that you can really work on. So, for example, Hu Yong's project on the diversity of collective victim beliefs was very interesting in that it was looking at this rather abstract psychological concepts, but from so many different cultural standpoints. And his interest in this concept actually really came from his own personal background. Kayla Hussey and Dr. Lindsay Blom, who worked on a sports psychology project. That was actually really interesting to me because I personally did not expect to see such an interesting conversation between sports psychology and peace psychology, things that might not otherwise, I don't know, have an obvious connection. But part of what made that project really shine was Kayla's own personal experience also as an athlete. So she knew on a very personal level and on a very passionate level, just the kinds of psychological effects it can have and what benefits it can have for promoting peace. Next slide, please.
Oops, there we go.
Yes, thank you. Oh, yes, this one. Yeah, and beyond really just having the passion for the project emanate from your personal history, from your personal life, of course, it's also really important that these projects are deeply connected with and for diverse communities. So this is a point that's been emphasized in the previous slides, but I thought it'd be good to kind of look at just how over just the past few years, a lot of the projects that we've seen have really come from all around the world. So here, we've featured a family conflict transformation project in the Dominican Republic. We have building immigration advocacy across across many different South American countries, the Maori and Pakeha perspectives in New Zealand as well. So you can really see that the grant really travels far and wide, and it works with so many different populations from very different places, experiencing different concerns and maybe having different needs with respect to peace. So don't, if you haven't seen a project like yours in the past, or if you haven't seen a project like yours in the literature, or if there are like, communities that you haven't really seen featured in what's visible in peace psychology or even psychology in general, I think the Small Grants Award is really a great space to gain a foothold to really support these communities and promote peace there. Next slide, please. And finally, of course, as Brida has mentioned, right, you want to really emphasize what kind of impact that your project is going to have. And it was really interesting to see how some of the projects really respond to very timely changes in the world, right? Like things that maybe you wouldn't have predicted in a year in the past. Suddenly the world is changing, and a lot of these peace psychology projects are just so much more responsive than maybe what you might find in otherwise laboratory-based or really survey-based research, right, in more mainstream disciplines. So we see that some projects work on emerging international crises. Macklemore's project on remembering possibilities for peace also works with how even thinking about our memories of the past can shape the way that conflict and also the resolution of these conflicts can take place in the present. So these are very interesting projects where it seems like these are just, intractable problems, right? Like, what can a psychologist really do in the face of international crisis or historical trauma? But you find that because of these projects, we're making advances in ways to kind of think about actual impacts that our discipline can have in these real world issues. Okay, I think yes. So final slide. So I've just talked about what the previous projects have been able to show, and I hope that these observations kind of encourage you that regardless of the different ways that you're thinking about peace, there's a lot of possibility for the small grants to support you. So once you do get the grant, once you're awarded the grant, we're very happy to share your research a lot more with the Division 48 through the Peace Psychologist, which is the division's official newsletter. And the process is also fairly straightforward. Once we get the list of all of the awardees, we really just start with an initial contact. So expect to get an email from me. And we'll just discuss basically the kinds of interview questions that we would want to use as a basis for the feature. And since, especially with the pandemic, we try not to really do any synchronous sessions. So we generally just agree on a list of questions, and then you can hand me your responses anytime between 2 to 3 weeks. So it's a very flexible schedule. We draft an article based on your responses to the questions, and then I just send you the draft for you to finally approve anything. So I properly represent you and your work. And finally, we publicize your work through the newsletter, where we not just talk about the research that you do, but also the motivations that you have, the vision that you have for the future of the project, and hopefully that helps you connect your research not just to maybe some journal publication down the line, but also to the broader peace psychology community in Division 48. And that often becomes a way for you to meet others in the field, meet others who share your interests. And yeah, so I think that's my piece. Next slide. I think that's all of it. Yes.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's been really a new and fantastic feature to be able to work with Josh to publicize your work, but also to really help you promote it in ways that can reach a much broader audience. And I think it's been an enjoyable process for a lot of awardees connecting with Josh and thinking about how to promote the work, because it has impacts well beyond what you can ever imagine. But I appreciate Josh outlining for you what the process is after you win an award. Stephanie, I'd love you to weigh in and add any perspectives that you have gained in terms of joining and just what you've done to put a lot of these slides together.
Yeah, so I think for me, the biggest thing that I bring to this is a person who has not successfully independently gotten a grant before. So I'm here as part of the panel today, but I'm here to try to think about the questions that I have in terms of putting together a grant, and try to think of some of the questions that other people might have in terms of you've already answered a lot of important questions about kind of the steps of the process, but so I have some questions that I'd like to ask, and then I think we also have a Q&A slide on here. If there's anyone who's attending who has questions, now is a great time to put those in. So the first question, okay, this is useful links. For some reason, I thought the next one was Q&A, but
there we go.
Yeah, and we can go back to the useful links. Yeah.
There we go.
So the first question that I have is going back to the application process. If I am a first of all, if I'm a dissertation student, can I use my dissertation as this for this grant?
Yes, you can. You don't have to enter your entire first chapter. You don't have to enter all of the specific details and work that you've done in your dissertation so far. Follow the application guidelines. The document, the proposal document, is actually quite short, 5 to 7 pages. And so you may not have to go into all of the detail that you've gone into so far with your dissertation. The key will be to tell the story. What are you hoping to do? How does it connect with peace psychology, peace education? And what are the practicalities? How are you going to do it? But yes, dissertation research is very welcome.
And then if I'm going to submit a dissertation for this process, would my dissertation chair or my committee members need to be listed on it, or would I just list myself? You
would list yourself unless they are really involved in implementing the project. You wouldn't list them. What you would need to do is identify what your status is with IRB. If you've got a research project that requires IRB approval, it's okay to apply if you don't yet have IRB approval. You'll see that on the application. There's an option to say not yet, and we stay connected with folks who can be awarded before they get IRB approval. It's the quality of the application that's key. But unless your dissertation chair or your committee members are involved in writing and implementing your project, they should not be listed in the application form. You can name them in terms of how they're supporting you. They're supporting your project. They're going to be part of that, reassurance that it's a well-supported and vetted project, but they're not the authors of the project. And so just letting us know who they are is important.
Wonderful, thank you. And then another thought that I have is if I'm working on a team, whether dissertation or otherwise, do all of the principal investigators need to be members of Division 48, or if I am and the other people are not, would that still be okay?
It would be important for the lead on this particular project that you're proposing. The lead would need to be a member of Division 48. And in that sense, it's going to be that person who's awarded the funding. So being very clear with your team about who's going to take the lead and who's responsible for the expenditure, the reports back to Division 48, that could be just you. They would be your team members. They wouldn't necessarily need to be Division 48 members. Of course, we would love them in our community. The important point is that the lead that you identify, that you say to us is the principal on this particular project, that person definitely needs to be a member of 48.
Another question, and I guess I didn't mention this before, the whole reason I'm actually even a member of Division 48 is because of the small grants program, because I found this small grants program years ago and was like, oh my gosh, my dissertation is peace related. I didn't even know peace psychology existed or that my research was peace psychology. So flashing back to my former self, what is peace psychology, or how do I know if my research or if my project is peace psychology?
Oh, wow. What a tremendous question. We could do a whole webinar discussion on that one, because it's not, of course, just what I say peace is or peace psychology is. So I think looking at the website will give you multiple opportunities to define that yourself. At the very granular level, the study of peace can be about peace, but also conflict and also violence. It can also be the study of social emotional learning, the study of conflict resolution in children, the study of peer mediation. It can be whatever is going on in a society, in a community, even in a family. We've had great applications that relate peace and peaceful existence with family work. And so it's not just about politics. It's not just about the individual or groups. It can be at any level of society. And it's about what supports and promotes both the maintenance of peace and studying conflict, the sources of conflict, the patterns within conflict, the reasons for it, the ways in which it's resolved, the cultural aspects of it. So what a wonderful question, Stephanie. I don't know that I can answer it right here and now, but I think part of the beauty of this grants program is also that the awards and the research and the programs that people are involved with and are promoting and are creating help define what peace is and what peace psychology is. So psychology then is, of course, the study of how human beings engage in that work. So it's really quite broad. And if you have questions about whether or not your project fits under this broad definition, let us know. A lot of people have created a rationale that has broadened our minds and really been exciting for the committee to be able to say, wow, that's a link I wouldn't have imagined or thought of before myself. So it's really a broad area.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I feel like what's really cool about this grant is this is kind of like this is peace psychology unfolding in front of us. It's people creating new threads and new pathways. And I was so glad that Joshua brought up the example of sports psychology, because that isn't necessarily where my mind goes when I think of peace, but when I think about my own self, and if I'm having a particularly rough day, if I move my body and if I breathe, suddenly I find greater peace. So yeah, that's such a wonderful connection. And I really appreciate the suggestion to check out the peacepsychology.org website. I know when I was applying before, I spent a lot of time just pouring through all of the different links and trying to find past examples and trying to find who the names were to try to read some literature just to kind of get some better footing in terms of the field. Another question that comes to mind in looking at the pretty dramatic difference between $300 and $5,000. I guess you mentioned earlier on, like it might be a part of a project. Could either of you speak a little bit to what a part of a project might look like? Because for me, as somebody who's not an experienced researcher, experienced peace practitioner, it's hard for me to understand what a piece of a project might be that would qualify for this grant.
That's a great question. So as long as it's a distinct piece of a larger project where you're in charge of it, where you're able to say, this is where the funds will be spent, this distinct piece of the project could be, for example, a training program that's within a much larger community effort. It could be a small piece of a research project that's going on where you're going to investigate and do survey research on a specific element of peace, conflict resolution, nonviolence, war. So it could be a piece of someone's larger research group, but again, you would need to be in charge of, we'll say, the expenditure of the funds, defining what the goals are for that element. It would need to have just some nice boundaries around what it is and where the overlaps might be for the larger project. Josh, do you have anything to add there? Because we have some examples of that as well from the past.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really important that that we also think about the different kinds of projects that can have different parts. So for instance, if I think about one of those projects where you're looking at a certain phenomenon like collective victimization across different populations. So like Korean populations, Hungarian populations, maybe a part of the project would be to focus on just one of the populations. And show how the grant specifically caters to the needs that are unique to that population, right? You can set the context for the project by saying, my overall dissertation is about maybe 3 different cultural groups, but for the small grant, you want to dedicate the funding that you're applying for to one specific cultural group. Another example is there's one project that we featured that was about organizing a consortium of different organizations that support the needs of immigrants, for example. So maybe the small grants won't necessarily cover the all of the activities of that new consortium, but it can feed into an important component to making that consortium, to starting it off, or maybe to building the network. So things like that. So depending on the kind of project that you have, depending on the ways it might be divided into these distinct, meaningful components, maybe that's one way to think about how to situate the small grant for these needs.
Great description. I was thinking of that project as well, that last one that you mentioned. Great, thanks, Josh.
Yeah, well, that exhausts all of the kind of beginner questions that I had from my experiences, but I'd like to, open it up if any of our attendees would like to get in, or if Joshua, if you have any questions that have occurred to you throughout the process that might help our future viewers of this recording to better conceptualize how they might get in on this project, on this program.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions.
Great, Emily, thanks. Go ahead.
First is it possible to apply, let's say you do get approved for the grant, are you able to use those funds towards expenses that have already been paid on that project?
Oh, that's a great question. Typically, we have not been able to do that, but that would be something where we would seek approval from Division 48, and sometimes the executive committee will approve that. And so I wouldn't, hold back and make that be the reason that you don't apply. But it is possible. We don't say no to very much, because the impact of the project is what's of paramount importance. And so I would suggest you make a case for it.
Okay. And then another question was, is it possible to submit 2 applications? If you have 2 different projects or ideas, can you submit both?
Yes, you can. Yes,
Cool.
you can. The committee would be delighted to receive your applications. Yes.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Great, thanks, Emily. I'm delighted you joined us. I mean, the committee would engage in a deliberation around, how to best use the funds. But if a person has 2 outstanding projects and it looks like the impact would really be tremendous, we look at each application on its merits and on its potential impact. And so, yeah, that would be super exciting. Ooh, I can't wait to see your applications. All right. Well, these were great questions. I think we've covered just about everything we've hoped to cover. As I mentioned earlier, I'm always available for any questions you might have. That's my QR code for LinkedIn. But we have a couple of slides here where you can seek information. Thanks again to Stephanie and to Josh for putting the content of this together and for just supporting this project. It's just been great to see this research opportunity and project and peace psychology initiative really grow over the last 4 years. I think when I started with it, sorry, I'm going back through the slides here. When I started with it, we had $7,000. This year, the executive committee has approved, I think it's $30,000. So it's a very important priority for the division. It's where the division is really putting its funds to work in communities. And it's a very meaningful thing for everyone involved. So feel free to reach out, and we look forward to receiving your applications by June 1st. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much, Stephanie and Josh. Thanks, Emily, for joining. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.